Hi everybody, and welcome to Module 8 on Political Geography. Like the other modules, we're going to just talk about 4 key points, and then there's some other things that are in the remainder of the PowerPoint and in the chapter that you should make sure you go over on your own. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk about some of the terminology that we use in political geography, some of which is actually quite specific to the way in which we talk about kind of international politics, and sometimes it's a little different than the way most people talk about countries and nations and that sort of thing. So we'll talk about that first, then we'll get into talking about electoral geography and looking at the example of gerrymandering, which is essentially drawing borders around congressional districts in different ways to affect the outcomes. We'll talk a little bit about political ecology, which is an approach to environmental issues, and then we'll finish off with a discussion of geopolitics. So, point number one, first of all, political geography, the definition, as you would expect, is the geographic study of politics and political matters, right? How is it people are doing political things across space? How does that work? So there's an array of both formal and functional political regions out there, and the most important political region is what we refer to as the state, or what a lot of people just call countries, right? But there's a very specific term here. It says, a state, the definition is a centralized authority that enforces a single political, economic, and legal system within its territorial boundaries, often used synonymously with country. So state here does not mean state like Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont. State here is essentially like the government. This is the centralized authority of any country. So people talk about the French state or the American state, and again, we don't mean the little territorial division, we mean the government, the apparatus. Sometimes people don't use the term government because people will say that like the government kind of changes like in the US every 4 years with elections, but the state is always the same, the apparatus that the new president kind of comes in and takes over. So the Earth is divided into roughly 200 independent countries or states depending on how you count them. And this is, the relatively contemporary map. South Sudan's on there. It's one of the newer countries. But this is the map that we're all pretty much familiar with. So tied to this idea of the state is the concept of sovereignty. And it says here, in the modern international system, states recognize each other's sovereignty. And what sovereignty is the right of individual states to control political and economic affairs within their territorial boundaries without external interference. We talked about this back in one of the previous modules when we were talking about population and how things changed after the Treaty of Westphalia back in European history. How before that it was a little all over the place in terms of governance of the area. After the Treaty of Westphalia, there's this ideal that there are states that govern a particular territory and they have sovereignty over that territory. So for instance, the French state has sovereignty over the territory of France, the German state has sovereignty over the area of Germany, and so on. Now, it gets a little more complex than that because, as we know, something like, say, where do the Americans have sovereignty? Well, technically over the 50 US states, but they also have military bases and embassies and occupying armies in some places like in Afghanistan. And so where the US has sovereignty is sometimes a little bit more nebulous than the ideal here, but you get the idea of what sovereignty means. Then there's another term, which is nation. And usually this is the one that trips up a lot of people because in geography, in political geography and social science more broadly, nation has a very specific meaning, which is a little different than what is often used. Nation can best be defined as being an imagined community. So nationalism, right, is this idea of belonging to a nation. So imagined community means it's the group that you think you are a part of. So in other words, I may be an American citizen, but that has more to do with the state and sovereignty. If I think of myself as an American, if I think of other people that are American as being similar to me and that we all are kind of in this imagined community, kind of having this shared trajectory through the world, then that's nationalism. And so it doesn't always correlate with governments or states. Like for instance, there are people who are Kurdish and they very much think of themselves as the Kurdish nation, but they do not have a government. They're split up among Iraq, Iran, Turkey, all these different countries that are in that area. They don't have their own state, but they still think of themselves as a nation. Also, there are Native American groups like the Sioux Nation or the Navajo Nation that talk about themselves as being belonging to one group of people. That's their imagined community, even if they don't have a sovereign government. And of course, this gets expanded to things even like, say, Red Sox Nation, right? It's kind of a silly example, but it's this idea that everybody there thinks of themselves as being all together in one community because they're all Red Sox fans, right? So think of nation kind of in that way. And so what that means is that, well, the reason that, the fact that we separate these terms state, sovereignty, and nation is important because there was this idea in the late 18th century that there was something going to be called the nation state, hyphen here. And it was supposed to be the ideal political geographic unit. The problem is that depending on how you define it, there are either very few nation states or no nation states. So according to the book, some of the modern nation states are countries like Germany, Sweden, Japan, Greece, Armenia, Finland. These are countries, let's take the case of Japan, where you have one government, or one state, the Japanese state, running the territory of Japan. They have sovereignty over those territories, and everybody in that country thinks of themselves as Japanese, as one nation. And so there's this combining of all those things. Well, most countries are not quite like that. So think of something like Iraq. In a place like Iraq, you have Kurds that don't think of themselves as being the same nationality as groups that are Sunni, and they're, of course, fighting against groups that are Shia. And so you have three different nations under one state. This happens a lot in colonial areas like in Africa, in a place like Nigeria, where you have all these different ethnic groups that think of themselves as different nations, all living under one government or one state. Can definitely make things much more complicated than this ideal of the nation state. And some people would argue, even when you look at these examples like Germany, Japan, etc., that it's not completely homogeneous. There are a lot of minorities in Germany today, a lot of people from Turkey and other areas of the Middle East that don't necessarily think of themselves as German in their nationality. Japan has a lot of people of Korean descent that have never quite been pulled into the Japanese nationhood. And so there's always these different minorities that might think of themselves as being somewhat separate. So this is a map, and we can question, I could question some of the things in here, but basically they talk about these are the ones that even meet the kind of general requirements of a nation state are in red. And you can see it's like the Scandinavian countries, Japan, Mongolia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Paraguay, but that most other states are not this way. It says nation states with sizable ethnic minorities excluded from the power structure, places like France, Italy, Russia, China, etc. Russia, most people may not know, the country of Russia, the percentage of people there that are actually Russian is about half. There are all sorts of other ethnic groups in Russia. And so you can see there's things like old multinational states, right? Like India has people that speak different languages, have different religions, different ethnicities, all under one state. So the nation state is this ideal, but it actually doesn't apply very many places. Okay, so that's the terminology stuff. Key point number 2 is about electoral geography and gerrymandering. Electoral geography is the study of the interactions among space, place, and region, and the conduct and results of elections. If you follow any of the American elections, there are maps galore now where you can look at things like for 2016, during the primaries, you can find maps that show this is where people voted for Hillary Clinton, this is where people voted for Bernie Sanders, this is where people voted for Donald Trump, this is where people voted for Kasich or Cruz and all this kind of stuff. And you can really break down exactly where these different demographics are for where people vote. And of course, politicians are really interested in people that know how to do electoral geography, because it's not just where people vote, but also what kind of people tend to vote which ways, and so they know where to target their advertising and this kind of stuff. So electoral geography is a pretty big and important field. On a very basic level, we all have probably heard the terms of red states and blue states, right? This is from, I'm trying to think which, 2012 presidential election, right? You have the states that typically vote Democratic, you have the states that vote usually Republican, and this is a fairly, this geography doesn't change a whole lot. Places like Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania sometimes flip-flop a little bit, and New Hampshire can be a place that also can go Republican or Democrat, but a lot of these other places, like California, for the next election, it's probably going to go Democrat. We can already say that already. Whereas Oklahoma, it's going Republican pretty much no matter what. We know that there's some solidness to these political affiliations. Now, one of the things that we did in one of the earlier assignments was look at these geographic patterns of voting, like between Obama and McCain during their election, where we saw just how this works out, not just state by state, but even within cities. Like we looked at Western cities like Austin, like Los Angeles or Phoenix, and you could see how there was often like a Democratic part of town and a Republican, usually like suburban area around that. And so you get these very specific geographic voting patterns. Because of that, map makers can actually help determine elections. And there's a technique called gerrymandering. And this is the definition here. It's the drawing of electoral district boundaries in an awkward pattern to enhance the voting impact of one constituency at the expense of another. And you can do this in two different ways. You can draw, like for instance, in U.S. congressional boundaries. The congressional districts, there's 300 or 400 some odd congressional boundaries across the United States. I don't have the exact number in front of me in terms of the number of people in the House of Representatives. Each district has about the same number of people, same population amount, a little under 1 million. And so every district has to have that, but where the boundaries are, like if we look at that example of like the Western cities where you have a Democratic core and a Republican kind of ring around it, you can decide how you want to make those boundaries in terms of how you're going to divide up that electorate. So there's a couple different techniques. One is called packing, where you draw district boundaries to take all the voters of one party and put them in one district. So since you make a district where, like let's say in one of those Western cities, you make one district be that little inner city, so it's all Democrats. And then you have a bunch of districts around it that have a couple of Democrats, but you can get a Republican majority. So you give up one district to the Democrats and give them almost 100% in there, so they always win that one. But that gives the Republicans the ability to win more of these districts around them. The other technique is to do what's called cracking, which is maybe you take one of those central cities and you cut it in 4 pieces, so those Democratic voters get put into districts that have a lot of Republicans, and then you just take that Democratic chunk, but not enough to turn the election. And so by doing this, you can actually pretty much determine who's going to win which elections where. So in my other classes, when I do in person, we have this exercise, which I'm not going to have this online course do, but I left this in here because it's got a nice link here where you can actually go and do simulations of how you can go in and gerrymander any area to get a lot of different kinds of results. You can basically take the same population, and in this exercise you take a population that has 60% Democrats, 40% Republicans, and you can divide up the boundaries so that you either get 4 Democrats, like 4 districts where you're going to elect a Democrat. You can also design it so you actually get 3 out of the 4 are Republican districts, even though they're a minority of voters in that whole area. So it's very interesting to see just how gerrymandered the American political system can be. And there's a couple links here, totally optional, but in the 2012 election, this gives an example of gerrymandering in the real world. Both Democrats and Republicans do it. The Republicans have been able to do it better in the US more recently. So in 2012, the Democrats actually received 1.4 million more votes nationwide in election for the House of Representatives. But because of gerrymandering and the way in which those votes were divided up, they lost a majority of the races, 234 to 201. What it means is that where the Democrats won, they typically won by big margins. But that still only gets you 1 person in Congress, whereas the Republican districts were a little bit more just slightly Republican, so it gives them more the ability to win more races. And so there's a couple different perspectives on it. One called the Great Gerrymander, who claims that this did happen, and then another kind of retort saying that redistricting didn't win Republicans the House. But most people recognize that the way the districts are currently set up, which by the way is done state by state, so if a Republican governor and a Republican state legislature are in power, they take their state and they gerrymander it to favor the Republicans, and the Democrats do it the other way. So like Illinois is gerrymandered for the Democrats, and then Republicans have gerrymandered places like Arizona, North Carolina, and other areas where they've had state power. So for instance, in the 2016 election, I'm actually making this before the 2016 election, but it's almost a certainty that Republicans are going to keep their majority in the House of Representatives based strictly on the way the boundaries are set up. It doesn't matter. The number, you would have to have probably 2 to 3 million more votes cast for Democrats for them to actually even get 50-50 here. So in New Hampshire, this is what our districts look like. And you can see it's got to be roughly based on population. There's not as many opportunities to gerrymander when you only have 1 or 2 districts. Obviously, if you have 1 district, you can't gerrymander at all. Vermont, for instance, is just 1 district, so there's no boundary making. In New Hampshire, they have to figure out where exactly are they going to draw this line to make 2 different districts of roughly the same amount of population. But when you get into the states that have even more population, things get crazy. This is an old map of the Arizona congressional districts, and you can see district number 2 is bizarre. It includes this area, it includes the Colorado River through the middle of the Grand Canyon, this area, and then down here, because the reason it's drawn so crazy is that a congressional district must be contiguous, meaning you can't just have like this be District 7 and then over here just a little chunk of 7. They have to connect. So they made it so that they connect on the narrowest possible path where nobody lives, and to take this area here and jump it in with this and this. This is a state that has a severely Republican gerrymandered system where you have about 50-50 Democrats and Republican voters, but they regularly will send 5 of the 7 or 5, 5 of the 7, 6 of the 8 districts will go Republican because of the way the boundaries are drawn. District 7 here is one of the giveaways to the Democrats, like, so they get this district almost every time, but by packing all the Democrats into that district, the Republicans are able to get slim majorities in all the other districts. Okay, so that's gerrymandering. The next key point is political ecology. And political ecology is a research perspective that's very popular in geography and also anthropology and somewhat in sociology, trying to understand environmental issues and the way politics influences environmental issues, and also how the environment can affect politics. Really, it's this idea of how power over space, right, sovereignty, affects ecology and vice versa. So political ecology is interested in trying to understand how political and economic forces affect people's relationships to the land, and often focus on things that are kind of proximate or immediate causes. Like, in other words, trying to understand how certain political decisions or economic decisions are influencing the way people would use a landscape. So for instance, if all of a sudden there's a new law passed that says you can't cut down trees, well, then that's going to have this impact on the forest. If you make a new law, or let's say if you make a law that says we are going to subsidize logging so that the government's going to cover half the costs. We're going to build all the roads for you to go into the forest so you can cut it down. Then all of a sudden all these people come in and start cutting down the forest. And it's because this different political and economic decision has been made. And so people in political ecology do something that they sometimes refer to as the chain of explanation approach. And so they look at the state, particularly the way the national land laws, resource policies, etc., influence land use decisions. And so chains of explanation just sort of means if you're trying to understand what people are doing in the local environment, maybe you have to look at these larger structures, like what is the government telling them they have to do or can or cannot do? What is the economy kind of giving incentives for them to do or not to do? And sort of it's putting those local actions in context. So in a lot of places, like in the third world, if we see deforestation in a place like Brazil, sometimes people come in and blame the people that are in the forest that are doing the logging and say, oh, these are the people that are responsible for deforestation. Political ecologists would question that and say, well, what is it about Brazilian land policy that is encouraging them to cut this down? What is it about the current economic system where if people go and cut down the forest and then do cattle ranching or grow soybeans, like there's this huge market for that, and that's also part of the reason why people are cutting it down. So again, it's this idea of putting environmental degradation in political and economic context. And I'll just mention too, like one of the other courses that I teach at Keene State is one in natural resource management, and we do a lot of stuff with political ecology to try and understand the kinds of decisions people make around land use and environmental issues. And so this is just an example of how you can see how different political decisions have huge impacts on the environment. This is the border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. You can actually see the border right here. On this side is the Dominican Republic. They have certain laws about how forests are supposed to be managed in this area. In Haiti, they have very different laws, and so you can actually go right to the border and see this huge difference in terms of the ecology based on the way those states are operating. Okay, last key point, geopolitics. This is the influence of geography on political entities. And so um, there's a couple things here. Long before there were air forces and missile warfare and all this kind of stuff, a country's survival was often aided by its geography. So for instance, the United States was very difficult to invade by either Japan or by European powers because we were on each side of an ocean from those other powers. Other countries have had protection from invasion because of large mountain ranges. Like, for instance, the Himalayas have sort of kept India and China apart or kept them from invading each other. Deserts like the Sahara keep the places in the north, kind of safe, or excuse me, the south, typically safe from influence of the north, but that's changing nowadays, now that it's easier to kind of go across some of these boundaries. And of course, now that we have intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear weapons, changes this yet again. And so that's part of geopolitics, is understanding how geography affects like international relations and politics. And also there's this idea that, looking at things like manifest destiny in the United States, this idea that oftentimes physical geographic features will be seen as the logical limits of a state's power, where they should have sovereignty, from this mountain range to this one, or from this river to this ocean, etc. So in the case of the United States, this idea after the founding of the U.S. that it should go from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific, that drove westward expansion, was part of this kind of geopolitical logic that the natural borders of the country should be the oceans. Yeah. One of the main theories of geopolitics that's been very popular in about the last century is what's sometimes referred to as the heartland theory, or there's a couple other. The heartland theory is probably the best descriptor for it. It was made by a guy named Halford Mackinder back in like 1900, and he was a British geographer, and he had this theory of how global politics works. And so this is an early 20th century theory, pre-missiles, pre-aircraft, and he held that the Eurasian continent, and that's like, like Russia, right? Europe and Asia is really kind of one landmass. That this was the most likely base from which to launch a successful campaign for world conquest. So Mackinder just said that there was basically two environmental regions in the world. The heartland, which is kind of in the middle of Eurasia, and the rimland, which is the fringes of Eurasia to the east, south, and west. I'm going to show a map here. Now, this theory is still believed by some and still gets brought up, but it has widely been discredited by people that are actual like geographic scholars and international relations scholars. But here's what it is. So there's these fallacies of the heartland theory, which is that it relied on this gets covered, but by the discredited doctrine of environmental determinism, which we talked a little bit about before. So here's his model. Halford Mackinder said, whoever controls the heartland kind of controls what he called the pivot of the world, and that the rest of the world is sort of arrayed around this, and that this was going to be a land power, kind of based military. And he said, let's see, I've got a better map here. Here we go. This is the pivot, right? Central Eurasia. Then he would say there's the lands of the outer or insular crescent. It means like island crescent, which he said would be like Britain, the United States, Australia, Latin America, and that there was going to essentially be this kind of battle for world domination between the islands out here and the central land power. And that where this battle was going to kind of take place was what he called the rimland, which is this area here, which is like Europe, India, China, Southeast Asia, Japan, etc. And so what his hypothesis, go back to this one, his hypothesis was that the heartland power would dominate the world if it was able to take over the rimland. If it did that, then all these other powers like the United States or Africa, Australia, etc., would eventually fall to this major power that was controlling the real major part of the world. Now, of course, today, who controls the heartland? That's mostly Russia. During the Cold War, after World War II, this theory was very popular among US and British politicians and military people. And so their idea is that they said you can't let the Russians take over the rimland, meaning after World War II, the Russians had influence all the way to Eastern Europe, right? They took half of Germany. There's this idea that you couldn't let them take Western Europe. You couldn't let them take Afghanistan and then move down into Iran or Pakistan. You couldn't let, the Russians move all the way down here to Japan, that sort of thing. When China became communist in 1950, a lot of people thought of Russia and China as being an alliance that was essentially all the heartland, and that it was, for all intents and purposes, this heartland power was then controlling this part of the rimland. And so to the US and the British, they felt it was vital, based on this theory, that they would have to go to war to stop the Russians or the Chinese from expanding. And then we get wars in places like Korea, Vietnam, and in the Middle East. And so this actually drove policy for a very long time. And that's why you saw a lot of these battles, and it was kind of framed in this battle between the US and Britain and France to a lesser degree, and the Russians and Chinese, which were communist at the time, and that it was this big geopolitical battle. So here's the problem with this theory. The problem is that it doesn't actually take into account the local situations going on in Korea, in Vietnam, or in the Middle East. It tends to take these local conflicts and cast them as being part of this larger world domination kind of puzzle, if you will. And so, for instance, Vietnam, to Americans and the British, the Vietnam War was about the heartland power, the Chinese and the Russians, gaining control over Vietnam, and so it had to be stopped. To the Vietnamese, however, that's not why they were fighting their war. They were a colony of France. Well, first of all, they were invaded. They were a colony of France. Then during World War II, they were taken over by the Japanese. And then after World War II, the French moved back in again and took over again. And Vietnamese just wanted to not be colonized anymore, so they threw out the French with the help of some of the communist powers. And that's when the United States kind of freaked out, and the United States comes in here. But to the Vietnamese, they were never felt like their war was about this larger issue of heartland power and rimland and all of that. They were just fighting for kind of more nationalistic reasons to have their own country. And the U.S. never really quite, I guess in a sense, understood that. And so there was definitely, I think, some problems with the theory. Same thing with Korea. The U.S. felt like they had to stop communist advances there, regardless of what the conditions were in South Korea. And even today, you'll hear things about Syria and Russian involvement in Syria framed in this exact same way, where that what the Russians are after is controlling more territory here so that they can dominate the world. Even though the Soviet Union's gone, there's still this idea that the Russians could still do that. So it's important to understand what this theory is, and the fact that it still has that there are people in politics and in military affairs who still believe in this theory, even though it has been widely discredited for the reasons that I just gave. Okay, so that's the end of the key points. The other video you should watch for this section is on the Ukraine. It's very interesting in that it shows what was going on a couple years back, why you're getting this split in the Ukraine between the east and the west side of Ukraine, and how there are pro-Russian factions and then pro-Western factions, and how this threatens the territorial integrity of Ukraine as staying together as a country. And of course, about a year, a little while back, the Russians actually took part of Ukraine, the Crimea Peninsula, and why that occurred, has to do with Russian claims to that area, because a lot of the population there speaks Russian. So it gets into some of the concepts that you'll see in the other parts of this PowerPoint around why countries split apart or might come together into larger units like the European Union and all that. So be sure to look at the rest of the PowerPoint and read the chapter and watch that other video, and I will see you at the next module. All right.